Well, welcome to Lecture 19 in Social Neuroscience. This lecture and the one after it's going to map on to Chapter 12 in Sapolsky's book, all about issues like obedience, hierarchy, compliance. And so today what I'll be doing is focusing on hierarchy and status, and then we'll talk more about conformity and other similar processes in lecture number 20. Now, in this lecture, you're going to hear a lot about hierarchy, obviously, and that we humans actually have a whole lot of hierarchies that we belong to. And it makes me think a lot about the phrase pecking order, that, you could say, I'm somewhere in the pecking order. And if you go and look at the origins of that phrase, pecking order, it turns out that it's coming from hens, from chickens. And it actually has to do with the fact that hens are really social, and they form themselves into a hierarchy. And the pecking order doesn't have anything to do with being fed. You might think that people, the hens that are at the top of the order would have like first serve or something like that. It actually has to do with their pecking each other, and how when they peck each other, the ones that do the most dominant of the hens, they'll peck the lower ranked hens, and then the lower ranked hens peck the hens that are lower than them, and so on. So that's the pecking order, and it's something that zoologists have known about for at least 100 years in terms of studying this and knowing about this phrase, pecking order. So let's go ahead and look at this now in more detail in this lecture, following the pecking order. So we're going to talk about ranks and hierarchies in the animal kingdom and in humans. And then I'm going to talk about some individual differences, some things that humans differentiate themselves on in terms of how they believe we should be complying with that pecking order. And so we have, first of all, right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, which are two key individual differences in terms of how people view their, how they fit into the pecking order. And then I'll introduce you to moral foundations theory that speculates about the fact that people around the planet have different values that they hold really sacred or important to them, and this might also have a lot to do with where they put themselves in hierarchies and in political parties. And finally, we'll dabble a little bit into this new field called political neuroscience, where people who are interested in political psychology have started using neuroscience methods to look at some of the questions having to do with politics. All right, let's take ranks and hierarchies first and talk about that. Now, I'm going to go ahead and show you some diagrams or pictures, illustrations of ranks and hierarchies in the animal kingdom that come from this 2022 article that was published by Dwartz et al. And it's really nice because in this particular article, they have this big chart early in the article trying to show you how social dominance and hierarchies can go all the way from fish up to humans. And so here, for instance, you can see down at the bottom there, at the bottom of this one, I have cichlids, a really colorful aquarium fish that a lot of people have. And cichlids actually have dominance hierarchies. You can see here that in the column it says, within a social group, who forms the dominance hierarchies? Well, adult males and females, when they're in the absence of males, will actually form such hierarchies. And the way that you can study this in the laboratories over on the right, this includes looking at things like distinct color patterns and courtships and agonistic behavior in the groups, how they peck at each other, how they actually attack one another, lets you know of exactly who's dominant and who's not so dominant among these cichlids. If we move up to trout or salmon and the Arctic char, you can see that juvenile males and females form mixed sex hierarchies. And the way you study this is you look at things like who gets the food, their body size, their agonistic behaviors, their behavior in dyads. Then we move up to the brown ghost knifefish, and then to the zebrafish. And zebrafish, again, a very common, very popular fish that people have in their tropical aquariums. These are actually very widely studied in neuroscience. It turns out that zebrafish are quite social, and they like to form hierarchies among their males and females. And so you can look at agonistic behavior in male dyads, sometimes induced by isolation. These are sometimes then used to interpolate the rankings of a group. So you can actually take any pair and then peel them off by themselves and then look to see who's the one that's more dominant of the two and actually figure out within a group or a school of zebrafish which ones are the most dominant. So there, we have really simple fish who have these social hierarchies. Let's move up a little bit to some reptiles and some mammals here. And you can see that we got lizards down at the bottom. These lizards have also have hierarchies, like among adult males, adult females, and juveniles will form subtle dominance relationships. And you can study this through aggressive displays in groups or in dyads. Move up to the rat, adult males, juveniles, and adult females will form dominance relationships that you can usually tell from their play fighting, who's sort of in charge, who's got the upper hand. And then finally, the house mouse, juvenile and adult males, adult females. And you can look at agonistic behavior in the groups. You can have these different tests, look at urine markings. Dominance can also be assessed between male dyads via what's called the tube test and conducted as a pairwise tournament to interpolate rankings within a group. So again, sort of like what they do with the zebrafish, you can take out a pair of these mice and put them together in this tube to see who's going to win, who gets to dominate getting through that tube. And then that tells you a lot about what they're like in their group. And then moving up to hamsters, other primates, and humans. Hamsters also show such hierarchies, adult males and non-estrus females. Females are dominant to males. They have agonistic behavior in groups. You can look at their flank marking behavior, their body size, their gland weight. And then you get to macaques, and surely, as you can read in Sapolsky's book, there's a lot of interesting work about how these groups of macaques can live together and form hierarchies. Some of them are more female dominated, some of them are more male dominated. And it's very easy to study these aggressive cues among them and figure out which animals are more or less the dominant individuals in the group. And finally get up to humans, and it says hierarchies exist between and within sexes and age groups across many contexts, like within one's family, their tribe, their town, their workplace, and their government. And it says under laboratory conditions, this dominance is assessed by, and they mention here, largely looking at studies in the fMRI scanner, where we can show pictures of people from different competitive games and so on. Let's look at a little more into the effects of having hierarchies for humans and other animals. And this is, of course, something that Sapolsky goes into great detail in his chapter. Sapolsky has dedicated much of his research career at looking at the effects of things like hierarchy and rank on health. There are many examples in that chapter, and I want to go ahead and highlight a few here. For example, low status is often associated with stress that has profound negative consequences in humans and non-human primates. In the US, the expected lifespan of adults at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale, so that is they're at the bottom of the hierarchy, is up to a decade shorter than those at the top. Socially subordinate male mice have greater arteriosclerosis and tumor growth compared to dominant mice. And arteriosclerosis would mean like their hardening of their arteries. And finally, some of this has to do with gene regulation, that low status animals have higher expression of viral defense genes and inflammation-related genes. And so this has been done in other non-human animals. Now, in that Dwartz et al. Paper that I talked about in terms of looking at social rank, they do talk a little bit about some of the brain systems that they believe are involved in the representation of dominance hierarchy. And you can see that a lot of the regions that we talk about in the human social brain are believed to be involved with the way that we represent dominance hierarchies in our everyday life. And then you can see the analogous sort of structures in rodents, although we don't have, for example, their impressions of what their identity is, or their views of status and so on. But the idea is that they perhaps would have very similar kinds of outputs to the way humans have had social ranks. Now let me go ahead and look at it. Now let's go ahead and look at a couple examples of human research that's looked at how the brain processes dominance hierarchies. And one of the first papers that did this was Zink et al. Back in 2008. Know Your Place, Neural Processing of Social Hierarchy in Humans, published in Neuron. In this study, participants were made to feel that they were superior or inferior to someone else, either in a stable or an unstable hierarchy situation. So in experiment 1, they set up a stable hierarchy setting, and then in experiment 2, they had this unstable one. And then after they had been made to feel they were superior or inferior to somebody else, they were then viewing images of that superior or that other person who was their inferior in the scanner. And the researchers in the article, as far as I interpret it, didn't seem to have any a priori hypotheses about which brain regions would be expected to differ, because it's one of the first studies to look at this. So they kind of just looked at a whole brain analysis to see which areas seem to be involved in the representation of hierarchies. So here's how the experiments work. So here's experiment 1 up at the top, experiment 2 at the bottom. You, the participant, always start out as what's called a two-star player. So they had it sort of like in the armed forces, where you have like a 3-star general and a 2-star general and 1-star general. You are a 2-star player when you first start out, and then you're introduced to a 3-star player who does this kind of task really well, and a 1-star player who doesn't do it very well. And so what happens is you play this game with them, and what happens is the 3-star player always wins, always beats you. You always end up beating the 1-star player. And so throughout all of the rounds, you basically are going to be winning some money whenever you beat or play that inferior player, and you very unlikely are not going to win when you play the 3-star player. So the idea is that you sort of learn across the rounds your stable status, that you're an in-between player here, a 2-star player, okay? In the experiment 2, what they do is they play the very similar game. You start out as a 2-star player, but as they keep playing the game, they get feedback that either moves them up or moves them down the hierarchy. So as they go through the experiment, their status can change. They can become a 3-star player or a 1-star player. And so the idea here is that it's a more unstable hierarchy because people can change their status, their rank, okay? Now, in both experiments, all of the feedback is completely bogus. That is, the experimenters are just giving false feedback to the experimenters to make them feel that they have been beaten by a superior player or that they have beaten an inferior player. All right, so that's just the basics of that study, how they kind of did this in the 2 experiments. And so what happened was they then looked at, like I said, the brain here in terms of stable hierarchies in experiment 1 or an unstable hierarchy in experiment 2. And in both experiments, viewing a superior player, a 3-star player, increased their activity in their occipital parietal cortex, their ventral striatum, and their parahippal cortex, which they said suggested greater attentional processing of superior player. So that is, when you are confronted with somebody who's your superior in the hierarchy, you're going to be paying a lot more attention to them because they are your superior. And so all these brain regions that they see here are the ones that you would necessarily assume would be involved in attentional processing. In the unstable hierarchy, they found more activity involved in the social emotional processing and conflict areas, for example, in the amygdala and more medial prefrontal cortex. So the idea here is that the hierarchy is changing. You could be going up or down. So there's a lot more social emotional stuff happening. There's more maybe processing of social information generally, and so that's why you get more MPFC activity. So that's just sort of a glimpse into what humans might be doing as they process social hierarchy in an experiment that was done in an fMRI study, in an fMRI scanner by Zink et al. Back in 2008. Now I'll give you one more example. This is looking at it in a slightly different way. This is Mason et al. 2014. You remember we talked about Malia Mason a couple lectures ago. She's the one that came up with that racial paralysis task. So what she's doing here is looking at social hierarchies. And you can see it's called Neural Substrates of Social Status Inference, the roles of the medial prefrontal cortex and the superior temporal sulcus. They hypothesized in this study that theory of mind brain regions would be involved in social hierarchy judgments. So when you're trying to make a decision about whether or not someone is above you or below you, or that somebody else is above or below someone else, they figured that you're mainly going to be using theory of mind regions to kind of put yourself in their shoes to figure out where they are in their status. So what they did in this study is they had their participants view pictures in the scanner. And what happened was the Mason et al. Had created images that were usually constructed in pairs, where they would have a single person, B, who appeared in both images alongside different people, A or C. And person B was always the heavier person in one image and the lighter one in the other. So they have that person B in one image, they're heavier, in the other one they're lighter. Or they put that person B in a high status position compared to the other person, or in a low status position in the other. So you can see the examples of these images down below. It looks a little strange because the heads are sort of like photoshopped in there. But the point is that you could see that that B person is either considered heavier or lighter. That's the person on the right in both pictures. And then you can see that that person B is either in a high status position like he is on the right, or in a low status position like he is on the left. And so that's how they created their stimuli. They had a whole bunch of stimuli like this, where they had these pairs of images. And so before each picture was shown to the participant, they were given an instruction to make a judgment about whether or not that person on the right weighed more than the other person, or whether that person on the right had higher status. So they would simply get this message: person on the right weighs more, or a person on the right has higher status. And so you would quickly look at the picture, press a button whether or not you thought that person had higher status. I should just say, by the way, really what they did was they would just say, look at these two people and indicate whether the person on the left is the one who weighs more or the person on the right is the one that weighs more. Or you would look at the picture and say, is the person on the left have higher status or the person on the right have higher status? So that's how they actually did it. So they're the participants making a judgment between those two people who weighs more and which one has the higher status. All right. So again, that's just something you do on individual trials. You never do it at the same time. You never make a judgment about weight at the same time you're also making judgment about status. So in terms of status, making judgments about whether or not the person's higher status or lower, which one's the higher status person, which one's the lower status person, that's where they think, according to their introduction, that you would expect more activity in the theory of mind regions. And so sure enough, on those trials where they look at an image and they have to make a decision about status, you can see that's the blue bars that you see here. And so what A shows us, that graph up there, is the medial prefrontal cortex. There was more activation when they were making a status judgment than they were when they were making a weight judgment. That B is the posterior STS. That's more activation when making status judgments than they are when they're making a weight judgment. And then we have the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. There's more activation there when they're making a status judgment compared to when they were making a weight judgment. So in all of these, you can see that they actually do show more activation in areas that supposedly are involved in theory of mind. So they seem to be making this sort of assessment about those two people, trying to get themselves into their shoes and figure out which one's the superior versus the inferior. What about weight? Was this perhaps just a thing where maybe the status caused all brain activations to go up? Well, in terms of weight, what they thought was that something called the intraparietal sulcus would be involved. And the intraparietal sulcus is involved in a lot of quantification judgments. When you have to say, is something heavier than something else? Is something bigger than something else? So when you're kind of like quantifying stuff, making those kinds of judgments, you see the intraparietal sulcus involved more. So sure enough, you can see here that when they looked at status versus weight, that the intraparietal sulcus was involved more in weight judgments than it was for status. And so that shows us then that it's not just something that's causing all of the status judgments are always causing more activation in different parts of the brain. It's specific, it looks like, to things like theory of mind. All right, so those are some studies just to show us how we could look at issues around social hierarchy in humans, at least in an fMRI scanner. Now let's move on to a different topic, and that's what's called right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. So let me go ahead and define each of these for you. Start out with right-wing authoritarianism. So right-wing authoritarianism is like a trait or an ideology that people can have, where you believe that you should be submissive to authorities, that a person has a tendency to almost unquestioningly obey an authority figure. They can also be aggressive to people whom the leader has designated as enemies, perhaps because the leader says that we hate those people, they're cockroaches, go kill them. And so people who are high in RWA would be more likely to be aggressive to those other people. And so you could see, for instance, that perhaps the people in Milgram's experiments who did obey, who went all the way with their shock, would maybe be people that you would consider high in RWA. RWA, by the way, has only been around since the late 90s. Altemeyer first talked about it there in 1998. It's measured with what's called the 22-item RWA scale. It's like a Likert scale that you indicate how much you agree or disagree with these statements. Things like the established authorities generally turn out to be right about things, while the radicals and protesters are usually just loudmouths showing off their ignorance. Women should have to promise to obey their husbands when they get married. Our country desperately needs a mighty leader who will do what has to be done to destroy the radical new ways and sinfulness that are ruining us. And gays and lesbians are just as healthy and moral as anybody else. So these are the items you would indicate how much you agree or disagree with, and then you would get a score on the RW scale. And if you have a higher score, that means you have more of that right-wing authoritarianism. Here's a little table here that I found on Wikipedia, of all places, that was from a survey looking at RWA's prevalence in different Western countries. And you can see that people who are really low on the RWA, it's about 13.4% of the US sample had that, but 25.6% of their sample were high on this. The UK, you can see it was a little bit more, they were higher on the low, there were more of people on the low RWA end. In Germany, there's more people low on the RWA and so on. Even in Australia, you can see that we have 17.1% of the survey would score low on the RWA, 12.9% would score high on the RWA, and so on. So this just gives you an idea of what right-wing authoritarianism might be like as an individual difference and how it's basically found across different countries, at least here in the West. Now, in terms of social dominance orientation, that's our other thing I want to define here. This indicates a person's support for social hierarchy and the extent to which they view their in-group as superior to other groups. It's anti-egalitarianism. That is, this is a belief that it's good to have hierarchies where people are above other people and there's other people down at the bottom. And so it doesn't mean that everybody should be treated equally. Not at all. It's saying that we aren't all equal, that some people are superior to others, and particularly people who are high in SDO believe that their own group is superior to other groups. And so they are often dominant, driven seekers of power who believe in like a dog-eat-dog world. Okay, so if you hire an SDO, you really kind of believe in all of this competition. So social dominance orientation was developed by Sedanius and Prado back in 1999. And these days it's measured with a 16-item scale. And the items on here are things like some groups of people must be kept in their place. It's probably a good thing that certain groups are at the top and others are at the bottom. It's unjust to try to make groups equal. Group equality should not be our primary goal, and so on. So you get an idea of the kinds of items that somebody who's high in SDO would agree with, because they believe in this sort of very hierarchical world. All right, so two concepts, RWA and SDO, they measure slightly different things, but they're often researched together in social psychology. What's sort of fascinating about RWA and SDO is that, there's all sorts of inequality in the world, yet people, particularly the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, actually have a general tendency to legitimize and accept the status quo. That is, even people at the bottom of the hierarchy often are high in SDO. They believe in these hierarchies, and even though they might believe that that they're better than other people, but their group is actually at the bottom in the hierarchy, they're going to be striving to move up the hierarchy. They believe in the competition to get themselves up there in that group. So RWA and SDO are correlated, but they also work independently of each other, depending on the specific culture and nation. So there's been a lot of cross-cultural research that suggests that in some cultures you might find high RWA but low SDO, or high SDO and low RWA. But overall, around the globe, people generally see these things as being correlated. And some theorists have even argued that perhaps RWA and SDO represent different parts of a larger personality structure. For example, just being authoritarian or loving authoritarianism. And this kind of goes back to some research that was done after World War II by Adorno et al. On the authoritarian personality. The problem with the authoritarian personality was is very much based on Freudian psychoanalytic theory, and so it kind of fell out of favor. But the idea today is that perhaps RWA and SDO kind of still tap into this general sort of personality type that's into authoritarianism. Another thing about RWA and SDO is that they are related to prejudice. So prejudice is higher in RWA, mainly because people who are high in RWA are motivated by threats to one's security. So they are worrying about that other group out there taking away and possibly hurting them, so they have prejudice towards that group. And in SDO, remember that SDO, you believe that your group is superior, and so because they are motivated by superiority and competitiveness, that's why they have more prejudice. So these two different kinds of ideologies do seem to manifest themselves in higher prejudice. Now, what do we know about the social neuroscience of RWA and SDO? Well, I'd say it's still early going. That is, just in the last 5 to 10 years, people have started to honestly or earnestly look into RWA and SDO. RWA and SDO map onto the concepts of social conservatism and economic conservatism. That is, RWA seems to map on pretty well to the idea of social conservatism, that you believe like in traditional values and upholding of authorities and customs and so on. SDO maps on really well to economic conservatism, like believing in a free market and lots of competition and not trying to make things equal. And both of those general political beliefs of social conservatism and economic conservatism are heritable. And so it could be that RWA and SDO are also heritable. Now, another thing we know is that damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex leads to greater endorsement of RWA. This was shown in a study in 2012 by Aspinall. So they found patients who had actually had ventral medial prefrontal cortex lesions, and afterwards, those people now had higher RWA scores. And why is that? Well, perhaps they speculate that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is needed when you're doubting beliefs. That is, in order to take a belief that someone passes on to you, you have to have some skepticism. And you use your ventral medial prefrontal cortex to, kind of scrutinize a new belief. But without having your ventral medial prefrontal cortex functioning, people are more likely then to subscribe to fundamentalist or other strong leader-imposed beliefs that don't really allow themselves to be scrutinized. SDO is also associated with activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the STS when viewing faces with people of different social ranks. So people who are higher in SDO showed more of this activity looking at different social ranks. Kind of makes sense, right? Because SDO is this endorsement of social hierarchy. And then as you look at pictures of people with different social ranks and you're somebody who really endorses social hierarchy, you get more of this activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the STS. SDO also moderated the performance of people in a gaze-following task using left and right-wing politician images as stimuli. This is an interesting study that was done in Italy where they took some Italian politicians and showed them to people who were very politically active. And basically, they had them the photos were cropped so that the politician would look to the right or look to the left. And then the participant was given a cue whether to look in the same direction as the politician or to look in the opposite direction. They had more problems looking in the opposite direction if it was their own political leader who was looking that way. So if your political leader, the person that you endorse, is looking off to that direction, but your signal to look in that direction, it's a conflict, right? And they found that people who had more SDO were more likely to show activity in regions like the mid-cingulate cortex and the insula when they had to do something opposite of what their leader was looking at. And so this was actually had to do with more, again, like SDO. The more you have this belief in social dominance and the hierarchies, the more you had problems with this particular task, and particularly showed sort of these conflict areas of the ACC and the insula. All right, let's move on to moral foundations theory. And moral foundations theory is another fairly new approach developed in the last 20 years to try to understand political behavior and how people function in hierarchies. Now, moral foundations theory was originally proposed in 2004 and then more popularized, I guess, by Jonathan Haidt in 2012 in this book that he wrote, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Researchers in moral foundations theory are interested in why does morality vary so much across cultures, yet shows so many similarities and recurrent themes. MFT proposes that the bases of morality are strongly innate, and they're universal psychological systems that are the foundations of what they call intuitive ethics. This origin of the theory in 2004 was largely a reaction to Kohlberg and Piaget's work that we talked about back in Chapter 7 in Sapolsky's book. That is, Haidt and his colleagues were not very satisfied with these Kohlberg and Piagetian stage ways of looking at morality, and they kind of just sort of redid it all, looked at it all again. And they were focused a lot on cultural differences and these differences and similarities, but now has largely turned to understanding differences among different political ideologies. And so the ones that they kind of focus on a lot these days are things like what underlies beliefs around progressives, or in the United States would be called liberals, people on the left wing, conservatives, or those people on the right wing, and then libertarians. So these tend to be the three groups or political ideologies that moral foundations theory tries to understand in greater detail. So what are these moral foundations? Well, originally back in 2004, they talked about 5 foundations that they thought were universal foundations that varied a bit as you went across different cultures. One of these foundations is care or harm. Now remember that all of these are supposedly based or rooted in some sort of evolutionary pressure. And the idea behind the foundation of care versus harm is based on our mammalian attachment systems and our ability to feel the pain of others. So virtues that are associated with people high on this particular foundation would be things like kindness, gentleness, and nurturance. Another foundation would be fairness versus cheating. And this is related to evolutionary processes of reciprocal altruism. And the virtues of this would be things like having justice or rights, autonomy. The third of these 5 foundations is loyalty versus betrayal. And this comes from humans' long history of living in tribes and dealing with coalitions and realizing that if you're going to be part of this group, you need to be loyal to it. And then people who turn against us, betray us, going to get kicked out. So the virtues associated with this would be things like patriotism, self-sacrifice for the group. Then our fourth foundation is authority versus subversion. And this is based on the primate history of hierarchical social interactions, stuff that's relevant to today's lecture. Virtues would be things like leadership, followership, deference to authority, respect for traditions. And the fifth one is sanctity or degradation, the versus degradation. This is based on the psychology of disgust and contamination, having more to do with our feelings of health, right? And so the virtues here are striving to live a less carnal, more noble way, believing that the body is a temple that you keep clean and respected. So each of these 5 foundations, the idea is that if you high on them on the thing that's on the first word of the 2, then you're likely to also put a lot of value on these particular virtues. And then in 2012 in Haidt's book, he introduced this 6th foundation called liberty versus oppression. And the idea here is that feelings of reactance and resentment people have toward those who dominate them and restrict their liberty. This is often in tension with the authority foundation. So you might strongly believe in liberty, nobody can put me down and tell me what to do. And the opposition would be that you're in favor of oppression. So virtues are that people come together to take down a bully or to oppose the oppressor because they want to have their liberty. All right, so those are the 6 foundations that they think underlie a lot of politics and morality around the globe. And then what they've done is they've tried to use this to explain different phenomena, particularly the culture wars that are happening in the United States and elsewhere in recent decades. So for example, here's a study where they looked at people who rated themselves as very liberal or left-wing to very conservative or right-wing. So you can see that down there on the x-axis. And then the y-axis is to tell you how much they really endorse that particular foundation of the original five foundations. So you can see that care and fairness are the 2 solid lines. And for people who are on the left, they strongly endorse that. On a 1 to 5 scale, they're averaging around 4. So care and fairness are really important to them. And then as you move from very left to very right, you can see it starts to go down a bit, only to about 3. But the more conservative you are, the less care and fairness actually are important to you. Then the other 3 foundations, loyalty, authority, and sanctity, those are really held very strongly in terms of rejection by people on the left. So those are really low on the scale in terms of they strongly reject those 3 foundations as being important to them. But the more you go towards conservatism on the right, you can see that those become more and more important. And so when you get to very conservative or conservative people, they really do hold loyalty, authority, and sanctity almost as importantly as they do care and fairness. So, in fact, what's really interesting then is that according to this analysis, people who are very conservative or conservative pretty much treat all of these 5 foundations equally important, maybe with a little bit more preference for loyalty, authority, and sanctity. But really what sets them apart from liberal people on the left is that the people on the left care a lot more about care and fairness than they do about loyalty, authority, and sanctity. So people on the left generally care a lot about care and fairness and much less about loyalty, authority, and sanctity. People on the right generally care about loyalty, authority, and sanctity more than they do about care and fairness. But these are still important to them. You can't say that they're unimportant or they strongly reject them. So these are interesting kind of ideologies again to kind of where these foundations, these moral foundations could explain a lot about why people from different political backgrounds have such a hard time getting along. If they have these real strong differences in opinion about what's important for how we should function as humans, like what's most important to us, care and fairness, for example, versus authority or sanctity of your body, these things are perhaps what's underlying all of that conflict that happens between people of different political groups. So that leads us to our fourth and final topic today, political neuroscience. And I wanted to get you to learn a little bit about political neuroscience, this new field that's really popped up in the last 10 to 15 years. There's a really great article here in Advances in Political Psychology by some of these early political neuroscientists, including John Jost, Hannah Nam, Dave Amodio, and Jay Van Bavel, all at NYU in New York City. And what they do is they try to argue in 2014 how this union of political psychology with cognitive neuroscience is going to be a beautiful friendship. And one of the first things they do is they indicate the parts of the brain that they think are going to be important in political neuroscience. And you should see that these are all the usual suspects that we keep talking about all semester long. All parts of the brain that would be involved in the social brain, things like theory of mind, processing of conflict, emotional processing, social processing. They're all those areas, the same ones that they think are going to be commonly observed in studies of political neuroscience. In 2014, then, in this article, they did summarize some key differences that were already known between the political right and the political left. They've said that political conservatism and right-wing orientation are associated with higher scores on measures of general economic and political system justification. That is, they like the status quo. So people who, again, are high in RWA or are also people who are politically conservative are going to be more in favor of just justifying the political system the way it is, the economic system the way it is, and so on. They like the status quo. That political conservatives report being happier and more satisfied than liberals or progressives here. So the idea here is that actually political conservatives like the way things are. They don't want to change things. They're quite happy the way they are. And so they actually tend to be reporting that they're happier people than people who are more on the left. People on the right tend to have a greater need to reduce uncertainty or to gain a sense of control or closure. So I'm sorry about the typos there, but it's to have a greater need to reduce uncertainty or to gain a sense of control or closure. That is, they like to make sure that the world is understandable, predictable, and they like to have control over it. And also that personal concern for and sensitivity to dangerous and threatening stimuli are higher in right-wing people. So the idea here is that people who are on the right tend to be more worried about their safety, more sensitive to dangerous and threatening stimuli. And I asked this question, what's the basis for this finding? Well, if you read that article, you'll see that one of the papers they think it really illustrates this well was a fairly new paper at the time by Oxley et al. And I want to go ahead and talk about that Oxley et al. Paper in a little bit more detail. So here's the paper. The title was Personal Concern for and Sensitivity to Dangerous and Threatening Stimuli Are Higher in Right-Wing People. And you can see it's Oxley et al., published in 2008, and it's in this journal, Science, which is one of our top our top scientific journal, Science. It's very difficult to get in there, and it's a huge prestige to get published in Science. So what did they do in this study? Well, they studied 46 adult participants who had strong political beliefs. And they tested the hypothesis that people who are more conservative would be generally more physiological responsive to any threatening stimulus. So they just thought, hey, if you score higher on conservative beliefs, you're probably going to be more scared of threatening things. You're going to have a bigger physiological response. You're going to be prepared to them. So at the first visit, the participants would come to the lab and they completed questionnaires that included some measures of their political beliefs. At the second visit, which actually happened 2 months later, they had their skin conductance recorded and their startle eye blink, which is recorded by putting facial EMG electrodes down on the lower eyelids so you can measure how much you blink. And they did this while the participants viewed 3 threatening images: a spider, a bloodied face, and a wound, a human wound with maggots crawling around in the blood. All right, so these are pretty disgusting images. And these 3 images were presented in an array of 33 other images. All right, so the images themselves are just mixed in with a bunch of other pictures that are not so threatening. And in another part of the study, they just presented them loud noises while they looked at a cross on the screen, like a little fixation cross on the computer screen, and then they would present a loud noise all of a sudden that was surprising and caused them to blink. So what did they find? Well, they divided these participants into 2 groups. based on their support for more conservative policies. So for instance, if they believed that there should be more military spending, they in favor of the death penalty, school prayer, etc., and also their opposition to more liberal ones like premarital sex, gay marriage, and gun control. So people were measured on these political attitudes, and so then you have people who are called the high support group. These are basically participants who support conservative causes and they oppose liberal ones. And then the low support group would be opposing of conservative beliefs or political attitudes and have more of a favoritism towards more liberal or left-wing attitudes. Okay, let's look at skin conductance first. So what we can do here is we can look at the threatening stimuli, these three pictures that were shown to them, and look at how much of a skin conductance response they had, how much sweating happened. And you can see that if there was somebody who was high for these more conservative protective policies, they call them, that those people had bigger skin conductance responses to the threatening stimuli compared to people who had more of that left-wing support, that were low in support of protective policies. On the right part of that graph, you can see that when you showed them non-threatening stimuli, all the other pictures that didn't have anything in there that was scary at all, there was really no difference in the sweating, the skin conductance activity. So it's only when they viewed these three possible threatening stimuli that you saw this difference between the high support group and the low support group. What about the startle response? What you can see here is that they went ahead and presented them different startle stimuli. A loud noise happens while they're looking at that fixation cross. And you can see that people who are in the high support group have a bigger blink amplitude. That is, they respond more to have a bigger startle response when they're startled. And this happens all the way through, that they always have a higher one. Now, across the experiment, it starts to go down. People start to habituate when they get startled, but you can see that the people in the high support group are slower to habituate, so they're more easily startled and for longer. Okay, so that was the study, and their conclusion then was that political attitudes and varying physiological responses to threat may both derive from neural activity patterns, perhaps those surrounding the amygdala. Now, they didn't actually measure amygdala activity here, but they speculated that the amygdala was probably involved. Indeed, given that political and social attitudes are heritable, and that amygdala activity also has been traced to genetics, genetic variation relevant to amygdala activity could affect both physiological responses to threat and political attitudes bearing on threats to the social order. So they're doing this nice little package deal here where they say, look, this sort of like hardwiring to being sensitive to threats in the environment and having that kind of physiological over response or that big response to stimuli like that could be also the same wiring that causes them to have more of these sort of conservative or right-wing political beliefs. Now, that study, like I said, came out in Science, a very noted publication, a very top journal. And since then, that study's been widely cited. As of early 2022, it had already been cited 825 times, which is a really high number of citations for an article that's only been out for 14 years. So you might think, well, gee, that's really exciting stuff, right? Yet, we can go ahead and look at some research here by this team that are in the Netherlands called the Hot Politics Lab. And the Hot Politics Lab is in their Department of Communication at the University of Amsterdam. And it's a really exciting group of researchers who are using physiological measures to look at things in political neuroscience. So I would recommend, if you want to look more at this and learn more about sort of like political neuroscience on the forefront and the cutting edge here, look at that website there, hotpolitics.eu. Two of their directors are here. That's Gijs Schumacher and Bert Bakker. I actually had the pleasure of visiting them in 2019, and they took me out to dinner, so I snapped that photo of the two of them. While I was there, though, visiting their lab and learning about the research, I understood that they were trying to get a manuscript published at that time that basically showed that they couldn't replicate the Oxley et al. 2008 paper. So they had done a very big multinational study trying to replicate the basic findings of those physiological responses to threat that differentiated people who are more conservative versus people who are more on the left, and yet couldn't replicate it. And they had this manuscript, and they sent it off to Science. And they said, Science, hey, you might be interested that we can't actually replicate that paper that you published back in 2008. And Science got back to them and said, hey, we don't publish replications. We don't really want to see a replication paper, whether it supports those researchers or not. You can send your paper somewhere else. So after a while, they shopped their manuscript to different places, and ended up getting published in 2000 then in Nature Human Behavior. And you can see here that the title of their paper is Conservatives and Liberals Have Similar Physiological Responses to Threats. So basically they're saying, nope, can't replicate what Oxley et al. Found. So in that paper, it's a very big study, big set of studies actually. First of all, they conducted a pre-registered direct replication of the Oxley et al. So they followed Oxley et al. To the letter, but they did it not just with a small number of participants like Oxley et al. Did. They actually did it with 202 participants. They also ran similar replications in the US, where they had 352 participants, and the Netherlands, where they had 81 participants. They used same stimuli, same methods, and they also tried conceptually similar stimuli, things like pictures of guns, dead dogs, vomit, and worms. And they also used the same measures that Oxley et al. Used, as well as some other better measures of social and economic attitudes. And they even assessed whether there was a threatening stimuli physiological trait. You remember, one of the things that basically Oxley et al. Argue is that you can show these three pictures to people and then measure their skin conductance response and just see if they kind of are hyper responsive to pictures of maggots or bloody faces or whatever. Well, interestingly, in the Bakker et al. Study, what they did was they looked at the spider, the wounded face, and the maggots, the wounded man with blood on his face, and then the maggots picture. And you can see that they say, well, gee, if those three stimuli are all measuring this sort of physiological trait, a response to threat, you should find that a person's skin conductance response to those particular stimuli should be highly correlated with each other. And actually, this is the correlation matrix that you see on the left from the Bakker et al. Study when they used those exact same stimuli. As you can see, that the best they could get was that there was a correlation of 0.3 between the wounded man and the picture of the maggots, so a Pearson correlation coefficient of 0.3. But the other two combinations of things were only around 0.04, practically zero, no correlation there between how people responded to the wounded face in the spider or the maggots in the spider. Therefore suggesting that there really doesn't seem to be anything about those three stimuli that should be grouped together because people are having very different responses to them. In fact, when you throw other kinds of threatening stimuli in, so that's what you see on the right, where they took some new stimuli and added them to the old stimuli, they similarly found very low correlations between any of these measures. Between any of these stimuli in terms of the skin conductance responses that happen. So it kind of just suggests that, hey, you might have gone ahead and took the average response to those three stimuli, but maybe you shouldn't have, because it doesn't seem like these stimuli actually do show any sort of consistency among them, that people, if they have like sort of a heightened response to threatening stimuli, how come they're not showing the same sort of response to all of those stimuli? Why is there such wildly different responses to all those different kinds of threatening stimuli? So anyway, now looking at the overall findings for this replication project, and you can see they've broken it down into all the different variations that they ran in this. What they did is they looked at the association between threat sensitivity and the measures of conservatism. So they're looking at how much of a physiological response the participants have towards those different kinds of stimuli, and whether or not it's associated with their measures of conservatism. And what you can see is that they've broken it down into social conservatism versus economic conservatism. If you look down the middle of each of those graphs, you can see there's a solid line there, and that would mean that there's no association between them. And the point that has a circle with it is actually what the measure of association was, and then you have like a 95% or a 99% confidence interval drawn around that point. And you can see that basically none of these stimuli actually cause an association that's greater than zero. That is, all of them include zero in their 95% confidence interval. It means that there basically is no significant association between any of the physiologic responses to those stimuli and the measures of social conservatism and the measures of economic conservatism. And over on the top ones, those are where they do the direct replication of Oxley et al. So they're following it to the letter. Don't get it. Index, by the way, means when they average across the spider, the wounded man, and the maggots. And then you can also see that across these other variations that they've done, nothing. They don't get any sort of association between threat sensitivity, at least the measure of physiological threat sensitivity they have here, and these different measures of conservatism. So it's a failure to replicate. And sadly, science was not interested in publishing this, even though this is a much bigger, I would say, a much better conducted version of the Oxley et al. Study, and yet they couldn't get the paper published there. Well, in that 2020 paper that Packer et al. Published, they have some discussions here. They say that the association between threat sensitivity and etiology has been considered an important piece of supporting evidence for the asymmetry thesis. That is, like the difference between conservatives and liberals, or the right wing and the left wing. However, our failure to replicate the biological correlates of etiology aligns with recent work that questions the robustness of the personality and etiology association. For instance, the contat overlap between psychological traits and etiology might explain the association between personality and politics. More troubling, panel studies failed to find evidence for the assumed causal effect of personality on etiology, and the causal arrow may be reversed. It could be that people's etiology motivates them to express certain trait characteristics. So what they're saying here is that, some research that they're citing in this article is that we don't really understand what the relationship is between any of these sort of personality traits or personality ideologies and people's politics. It could be that the politics is what drives their traits, or it could be that the traits are driving the politics. We don't know. We don't have any evidence of any causality yet. They suggest that a better approach might be to look at how physiological reactions and experienced emotions are related to people's intuitions that are then regulated by top-down processes. So they're saying maybe it's more complex than that. Maybe some of these people actually do have these physiological reactions that are sort of threat sensitive, and then depending on their upbringing or what culture does, it kind of tells them how they should deal with those experiences, those intuitions, and it kind of gives them answers or not. So it just suggests a more nuanced or complex version of how all of this might work. So that is the end of my little introduction to political neuroscience and the end of this lecture following the pecking order. We've looked at ranks and hierarchies. We've looked at right-wing authoritarianism and the social dominance orientation. I've introduced moral foundations theory to you, which is based a lot on evolutionary processes, and then finally an introduction to political neuroscience. We'll talk more about some of these topics at the next lecture. I look forward to seeing you then.